Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on printers. Now in this lesson, we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at the different types of printers. There's laser printers and inkjet printers, things like that. We're going to look at those different types of printers. But before we do, there are some basic fundamentals that are pretty much true about any type of printer. And so I'd like to go over some of those with you first. So first, let's talk about some of the just general printer characteristics. Okay, so regardless of what type of printer we're talking about, there are certain basics that just exist to printers as a whole. Okay, I mean, first of all, what is a printer, right? What's the idea behind it? The idea is to take data or information from a computer and be able to get that information out onto paper. I suppose it could technically be, there are other materials you can put into printers. Sometimes you can have like transparencies and glossies and other things like that. But the idea is to basically get it down in ink, so to speak, right? Actually have a physical piece of paper or some other material that contains the data that was once only on the computer. Now, similar to the way displays work, even though we see all kinds of pretty pictures and text and stuff coming out of these printers, the reality is this is all made up with a bunch of dots. Okay, and to take it a step further, you can take a bunch of dots and put them together and even make pixels. And the quality that you get of your printout is measured by resolution. And the resolution is measured by something called DPI, which stands for dots per inch. Okay, and this is measured both vertically and horizontally. And dots per inch means just that, right? We talk about a bunch of dots, you put them together, it makes up a pixel. Well, if we were to say that the resolution was 600 by 600, then what it means is in that square inch, you have 600 dots across by 600 dots down. The main thing for you to remember here is the more dots, the better the resolution. Okay? If you think of it this way, if you were to draw a picture, and I know there's some real famous artwork that was done all with dots, right? But let's say you wanted to get creative that way, and you were going to draw me a picture, but you weren't allowed to take your pen or pencil and draw in a smooth line across the page. You had to actually just do one dot at a time. Well, the fewer dots that you use, the more generic or draft-like your picture is going to look. Whereas the more dots you use, right? If you use a large quantity of dots and you bring them very close together, you can make it almost look as though you didn't use dots. And again, I refer back to certain famous pieces of art that you can go and look at in the various museums around the world. And many of these pieces of art were all done with dots, but you can't even see the dots. If you stand just a few feet away from the painting, it doesn't look like dots. And as you get closer, if you really get up close, you can notice it's a bunch of dots. Well, that's the same idea here. Okay, so the more dots that are used, the closer together they're going to be, and the better the resolution or the better the image is going to look. Now, another rating, I suppose, all right, because that's one rating is something called resolution, but another rating that we can have on our printers is not just the quality of the picture, but the speed. And the speed of the printer is typically measured, okay, usually in the case of laser and inkjet printers, you're talking about ppm, or pages per minute. And it means just that. How many pages of information can be produced per minute? When it comes to pages per minute, it's real easy. The fewer or the lower the number, the slower the printer. Okay, if you have a very low number of pages per minute, well, it's a very slow working printer. And if you have a very high number of pages per minute, then it's a very fast working printer. Now, a couple things that I want you to keep in mind when it comes to pages per minute. And that is the rating, first of all, it could, depending on the type of printer, it could be evaluated based upon the quantity of data that is going to be on that particular piece of paper. So keep in mind that although you might have a printer that says it's going to give you 10 pages per minute, and then you have this picture that you want to print out, and it's not, right? It's suddenly giving you 3 copies per minute, right? 3 pieces of paper come out every minute. Well, it might be that you have so much information on that page, and there's so much ink, we'll just generically call it right now, that needs to be put on that paper that it's not able to do what the printer is rated at. Okay, there's certain specifications that the printer will be rated based upon a certain average amount of text, we'll say, or ink that's put to the paper. The other thing I want you to keep in mind when it comes to pages per minute, because I will tell you there's a number of printers where it doesn't matter how much ink you're using. The other factor to keep in mind is pages per minute has to do with how fast the printer itself, the physical machine, can go through its process of grabbing a piece of paper, sending it through, getting the ink on it, and handing it off to you. You need to keep in mind that there's still a processing time that is involved from when you are on a computer and you say, please print, and then it needs to then process that, and that's a whole different process that's actually out of the context of what we're talking about right now. But there is a process there of what the computer needs to do from when you hit a button that says print to be able to send it to the printer. And in some cases, I will tell you, it even comes down to the way the computer is connected, and we will talk about that later on in this lesson as far as the type of connection and how fast the connection is for the computer to communicate with the printer itself. But the pages per minute has to do with, specifically, once the printer has the information, how fast it can produce it for you. Now you notice I do also have another set of letters here besides pages per minute, and that's CPS, which stands for characters per second. And that has to do with some of your older impact printers would be rated, and you could pretty much guess what that means. On an older printer where you're only doing text, basically, it's now measuring how many characters it's able to do per second. So when we get to talking about impact printers, I think that'll make a little bit more sense if you're not familiar with what that term means. Now when it comes to paper characteristics, well, first of all, you need to be familiar with the sizes, right? So we have letter, right? If you ever hear that something is going to be letter sized, okay, it means 8.5 by 11. We have legal, which is 8.5 by 14. Executive, 7.25 by 10.5. Ledger, 11 by 17. There's also special A4 used, which is very similar to letter, but slightly different. I should mention I'm going off of US standards here. Okay, but some of the other things that you need to keep in mind when it comes to the paper itself, well, one thing I mentioned is, well, the speed, right, pages per minute. The other thing you need to keep in mind is that different printers have different paper handling capabilities. Okay, some printers will have an actual tray that can hold the paper, and I'm talking about holding the blank paper that's waiting to be used, whereas other printers, you'll just have to feed the paper. Okay, there is no tray, and we'll actually learn when it comes to like impact printers or old dot matrix printers, there's a bit of a feed. Okay, so there's different ways that the paper can be held and prepared to be printed onto. Some printers will have multiple trays so that you can either A, store more paper, or B, and this is the more specific reason why they would have multiple trays, be able to go ahead and use different types of paper for different printing needs. Maybe you put different sizes in different trays, or maybe you just put plain paper in one tray and you put your company's letterhead in another tray. Or maybe you have label paper, right? Paper that already has labels that you can peel off and stick onto things. Maybe you have that if you're working in a shipping department. You have that in one of your trays. So different printers are going to have different options as far as the trays go. We also have different ways of handling the paper as far as, do we just simply print on one side? Or maybe we do something called duplexing, which is where the printer has the ability, all by itself, to take a sheet of paper, print on one side, but not give you that sheet of paper. it will then flip that paper over inside the mechanism and print on the other side. Now, some printers offer duplexing, but it's manual duplexing, where you have to go ahead and print to one side. The printer will stop, give you instructions on what to do with the paper that it has given you, as far as how to flip it over in a certain way and put it back into the feeder or into a paper tray, and then tell it to continue to print on the other side. Okay, but these are some of the just general things that you can do with the paper, the different options that you have with your various printers. All right, so let's actually get in here and talk about some of these types of printers. And the first one I want to do, and I will tell you, I used to teach printers in the opposite direction than what I'm about to do here. What I used to do is I used to start from the old technology that we don't see anymore and work our way up to the laser printers, which is probably the number one technology that we see in today's world. But because we've now gotten to the point where really the two main types of printers that are out there for 90+% of our printing needs are laser printers and inkjet printers, I'm going to go ahead and let's talk about those, and then we'll spend a little bit of time at the end here just making sure that you understand the specifics of some of these older printers in case you come across them. First one here with the laser printers. This is actually very cool. If I've bored you up to this point talking about things like pages per minute and paper duplexing and all that, well, now it's time to wake up, all right? Because the laser printing process is a very cool one. A lot of people are very curious about how laser printers work. A lot of people think, oh, okay, it's a laser. So it's like, you picture like in a movie, and you picture some kind of a laser, and it's like drawing on the paper. Well, that's not exactly how it works. And you probably know that already if you've ever worked with a laser printer in any capacity. In other words, other than just being the end user who prints. If you've ever had to change a toner cartridge, well, then you know that it's not a laser that's actually just writing on the paper because, well, there's toner, there's ink. So what does the laser have to do with it? So we're going to go through this process here, and if you don't get anything else from this lesson, I want you to understand how the laser printing process works. It's a 6-step process, and you need to know all 6 steps. Every one of them is important, and if any one of them fails, well, then your printing will fail to some degree. You may actually still get a successful print, but something won't be as good as it would be if all 6 steps were working. All right, so here's how it works. Here I have just kind of an image kind of generalizing what the inside would look like as the paper passes through. And I should mention, by the way, when I show the paper's path here, the way it's listed, it would be moving from right to left. All right, the paper would be coming in on the right and exiting out on the left. Now, another thing I want you to understand before we get into the actual 6 steps is I mentioned this stuff called toner, and a lot of people think of toner and they think of it as being ink, right? Well, believe it or not, toner, what it's made up of is tiny, tiny, tiny little crumbs, and they're even smaller than crumbs, but tiny little pieces of iron. Okay, they're little shards of metal, basically. Okay, little pieces of iron, and that's important to understanding this process because these tiny little pieces of metal, these little pieces of iron, they can be magnetized. Okay, and a lot of this has to do with that. So let's take a look at this. Step 1. Step 1 in the printing process is cleaning. And this basically has to do with making sure that there's nothing left over from a previous print job. All right, so step 1 is basically getting it ready. Make sure there's nothing left lingering from before. Okay, so there's this cleaning blade that I've got illustrated here and a discharge lamp. And the idea behind this discharge lamp is it will neutralize this photosensitive drum. Okay, and remember, here we're saying photosensitive, and I'm also mentioning the fact that besides the drum itself being photosensitive, and if you think about it, photosensitive has to do with light and what light does to it. Hey, and lasers are light. Okay, kind of makes sense here. But I mentioned as far as the magnetizing. So the cleaning the idea is we just have this blade, and it's doing a combination of discharging any remaining magnetic charges that might be on this drum, as well as actually scraping any residual toner that might have been left lingering away. Step 2, it's called conditioning. This is also sometimes referred to as the charging phase. And there is a primary charging roller involved, and what this roller is going to do is it is going to provide a solid, uniform negative charge to the entire surface of the photosensitive drum. Okay, so the idea here is it's going to negatively charge this drum. Again, think of magnetism, and it's giving a negative charge. And the main thing that I want you to be aware of here, if it's not obvious, is when it comes to magnetism, opposites attract. So if you have a negative charge, it's going to attract to a positive charge, and it's going to repel if it sees a similar charge. Okay, so that's what I want you to think about here is you have this drum, and it now has one big solid negative charge. Which then takes us to step number 3, which is the writing phase, or sometimes we call it the exposing phase. And the idea is this is where the laser comes in. Okay, right? We're talking about a laser printer. This is where the laser actually plays a role. We have our laser beam, and there are mirrors involved, okay, so that the laser can be shot out and hit the drum. I don't want you to worry too much about the mirrors as much as just keeping in mind the idea that you have this laser beam that's going to hit this photosensitive drum. And what it's going to do, well, as the laser hits the drum, it's going to take the negative charge on the area of the drum where the laser actually hits, and it's going to make it a positive charge. Okay, that's what happens to this photosensitive drum. When light hits it, it gets positively charged. So the idea here, and again, by the way, remember, everything's always done in dots. Okay, and so that's why I've kind of tried to illustrate this with dots for you. The idea here is that you have all these negative charges uniformly across the drum, but the laser beam, as you can see here, has etched out the letter T on the drum. And it's not necessarily exactly the way, again, I'm trying to just give you a representation here, but it's gone ahead and it's etched out the laser T. And in that area, it's now positively charged. Okay, so picture you have this drum now. It all has a negative charge other than the areas where the laser hit, and it's now positively charged. Now, why is that significant? Well, that is significant because of step number 4. Step number 4 is called developing. And this is where the toner, right? We have the toner that we always have those toner cartridges we put in. We have that toner that I talked about was these little iron particles. Well, they are also negatively charged. Okay, so if you think about it here, what's going to happen when you have negatively charged particles and they are put up against this drum, which is partially also negatively charged and partially positively charged? Remember, they're going to repel away from the negatively charged part of the drum because negative and negative, they're going to repel, and they are going to be attracted to and stick to the positively charged portion of the drum. Okay, so this is how it ends up looking. You have this developing cylinder, right? And this is where the toner is. This toner's in this cylinder, and as they roll together, the negatively charged toner is going to go ahead and attract itself to the positively charged area of the drum. And it will repel itself, of course, from the negatively charged area. And that then brings us to step number 5, which is called transferring, where we have the transfer charging roller. Okay, so this transferring charging roller, what it's going to do, and I'm trying to think of how to explain this because this is where a lot of people get very confused. Essentially what it's doing is it's giving the impression that it's giving a positive charge to the paper. I've actually heard it taught where that's exactly what's happening. It's literally charging the paper. It's giving that paper a positive charge. And when the paper has a positive charge, and remember you have all that negatively charged toner sitting on the drum, well, it's going to leave the drum and it's going to then be attracted to the paper, right? Because it's positively charged. Well, it's not exactly that way. The idea is that this transfer charging roller is, the roller itself has the positive charge. And as you can see from the illustration here, the paper passes in between the charging roller and the drum. And so what's going to happen is as that paper passes through, have you ever, maybe when you were a kid, ever did the old thing where you had maybe you had one magnet and it was on a table and it was a thin table? And then you took another magnet and you put it underneath the table and you started moving that other magnet around and you saw how it moved the magnet on top of the table. Or maybe you even did it with paper. Okay, well that's the same idea here, is the magnetic charge will pull right through the paper and it will pull all those negative charges right onto the paper. Okay, so what we have here is as the paper passes between the photosensitive drum, which has all the negatively charged toner, and then also on the other side of it, it's kind of hard to see in this illustration, but it's in green and it's underneath. I have a little arrow pointing to it, the positively charged transfer roller. It pulls the ink onto the paper. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, what about the rest of the drum, which is also negatively charged? Isn't it pulling that onto the paper? Sure it is. Why not? But who cares? It's just a roller. There's no ink there. The only ink are those little toner particles, and that's what's going to be transferred onto the paper. And then finally what we end up with step 6 is what's called fusing. Because if we're going to go ahead and we're going to take all these little metal particles and pull them onto the paper, well, if you think about it, if it just handed us the paper at that point, well, they would all just kind of fall off and smear all over the place and it would be ugly. So we have step 6, which is fusing, which is the idea of heating up the paper and the ink so as to fuse it together. Okay, so it literally melts these tiny little toner particles to the paper. It fuses them together. Okay, so basically, I kind of drew it out here. You have your radiant heat lamp and a fusing roller. I mean, the idea is, and I'll tell you what, let me jump back here just kind of to this picture right here. The idea is you have these rollers that the paper's going through, and as part of this process, everything's heated up and then pressed so that these little iron particles, these little toner particles, actually become fused and become part of the fibers of the paper itself. And that's why, if you have ever taken a sheet of paper, it comes out of the printer and you grab it right as it comes out of the printer, it's warm, right? Now, even though I will tell you, the fusing process very often, it is heated up to very extreme temperatures. You need to be very careful never to actually touch the fusing roller because, I mean, we're talking about like up to 200 degrees Celsius. I mean, that's way past boiling. I mean, this is scalding hot. Even though that's the case, the paper itself is not a material that's going to retain that heat very long. So even just in the time from when it's heated up, fused, and then spit out of the machine and sit in a tray waiting for you to take it, it's not going to burn you. But you'll notice it feels quite warm, especially if it's a cold day. Sometimes you grab it and it's like, ooh, warmth. It's kind of nice. Okay, so those are the 6 steps to actually get, in this case, a big letter T onto a piece of paper. Okay, so just to review real quick, because again, remember, if you get nothing else from this lesson, you must, and I mean you absolutely must, understand these 6 steps to how a laser printer works. Step 1 is cleaning. The idea is going ahead and cleaning off any leftover toner. And the way we're doing that is through a process of scraping it off and through neutralizing any charge that's on the photo drum. Right? Because if it's not charged, well, then it's not going to hold on to, there's going to be no magnetic attraction. Step 2 is conditioning, or some people will say charging. And this is where we put a uniform negative charge onto the photosensitive drum. Step 3 is writing or exposing, and this is where the laser actually comes in and positively charges the parts of the drum where you want the ink to be. And again, it's because it's a photosensitive drum, and anywhere light touches it, it gets a positive charge. Step 4 is developing, which is where we go ahead and apply the negatively charged toner to the drum. So of course it sticks to the positively charged areas, but not the negatively charged areas. Step 5 is transferring, which is how we get the toner or the ink from the drum onto the paper. And the idea is by, and again, some books will say that you're positively charging the paper, but what you're really doing is you're kind of putting the paper between the drum and a positively charged roller so that it pulls it down onto the paper. And then step 6 is called fusing, which is where we heat it up and press it right into the paper. And that's how it all happens. And this 6-step process happens for each rotation of the drum. Okay, and I will tell you that very often, I mean, the drum isn't even going to be an entire sheet of paper. So this process happens over and over again, even within one sheet of paper being printed out. Speaking of the toner cartridge, I talked about the photosensitive drum, and that's actually inside of the toner cartridge. But here's a picture of a toner cartridge, okay, just to give you an example of what one looks like. If we were to look inside of it, okay, the cartridge as a whole, well, the photosensitive drum is actually part of this cartridge. Okay, now not everything that we talked about is inside the toner cartridge, but a lot of it is. So for instance, step 1, where we have the cleaning blade, that's actually found inside the toner cartridge. In step 2, we had conditioning, where we have our primary charging roller, or what's also sometimes referred to as the primary corona wire. Okay, that's another term for it that I'd like you to be familiar with in case you ever hear anybody or maybe even see it on an exam where they talk about the corona wire. The primary corona wire is where we have our charging roller. And then, of course, there's the developing cylinder, and that's the part that seems obvious. If it's a toner cartridge, well, that's where the toner is. Okay, so I want you to keep in mind that a lot of the stuff here is actually contained inside of the toner cartridge. As a matter of fact, if I could real fast just take us back to my other diagram. All right, let me just kind of show you back on the diagram. Take a look. You can kind of picture here where the toner what part is inside the toner cartridge. Okay, you have that photosensitive drum, you have the cleaning scraper, you have your corona wire or your charge roller, and then of course there's the toner itself, the developing roller. But if you look at this illustration here, everything else in the paper path has to do with either just rollers that would be inside of the printer, not inside of the toner cartridge. And of course we also have the transfer roller, okay, which is down at the bottom, which is not inside the toner cartridge. It would be on the other side of the paper, right? And then of course we have the fuser, and the fuser is not inside the toner cartridge either. That's also part of the printer. Okay, so just to kind of try to help you understand how this stuff looks in a real laser printer. Now, when it comes to laser printer maintenance, let me tell you what the number one maintenance thing is for a laser printer, and that would be replacing toner cartridges. Okay, again, remember, a lot of what makes up the 6-step process, well, a lot of that is all contained within that toner cartridge, right? I mean, if something were to happen to that photosensitive drum, well, it's kind of nice that that's in a toner cartridge, because rather than replacing a very expensive printer, you can just replace an inexpensive toner cartridge. Okay, if you're having problems with the charging roller or the corona wire or the cleaning blade, and these are all things that are contained within the toner cartridge, not just the toner itself. Now, even if those don't go bad, and very often those don't go bad, because these toner cartridges are designed to last for at least as long as the amount of toner that's inside, the actual ink itself, the actual little iron particles. Okay, so that's the number one thing that you're going to do when it comes to printer maintenance. But beyond that, well, sometimes you might do a little cleaning, okay, and the cleaning might be maybe some cleaning up, some vacuuming of little toner particles that maybe have escaped toner cartridges over time and have gotten into the rest of the printing mechanism. You may want to clean the rollers if the paper's not feeding through properly. Okay. There is also calibration, and this would only be on a color laser printer. Calibration is something you see on color printers as a whole. You also see it on inkjet printers, okay, where you need to calibrate and make sure that the different colors are all lined up with one another. Now, there are also these things called maintenance kits that you can get for your laser printers, which very often will have miscellaneous replacement parts, such as maybe the fuser assembly. If you find that your printouts are just fine, but the ink is smearing, you have the paper sitting there waiting for you to take it, you grab it off the printer and you notice it smears and now you have ink on your hands. You're like, what's going on? Well, it means that the fuser is not doing its job. So you may want to replace the fuser. Different rollers, pads that you may also want to not just clean, but sometimes cleaning is not good enough. They truly get worn. They just have no grip left to them and they have to be replaced. Now, this is not something you're going to do very often, and quite frankly, especially when you're talking about dealing with something like the fuser, a lot of times what you'll do is if you have an inexpensive printer, well, you'll end up just using it until this stuff breaks and then you buy a new printer. If you have a more expensive one, then sometimes you'll have a maintenance contract with the company you bought it from, and you'll let the professionals come out. Okay, and I know that you're looking to be an IT professional, but even as an IT professional, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a printing professional. So you may want to leave that up to somebody who deals specifically with printers. And very often these are the same people who will maintain your copiers. Which, by the way, I should mention that's a whole different type of printer that I don't have on my list, so to speak here. But you have these multi-function printers where they not only print but they also copy, and they can fax and they can scan and all kinds of fun stuff. And it doesn't have to do with whether it's laser or inkjet, or it doesn't matter. Those technologies just mean how is the ink basically getting on the paper. But sometimes you have more than just the ability to print from a computer. Sometimes you can actually do copying, or you could do the other direction where you scan from paper into the computer. Anyway, printer maintenance, pretty much changing toner cartridges, occasional cleaning, maybe you replace a part. Lots of times you're going to leave that up to somebody you have a contract with. Moving along, let's talk about our inkjet printers. Now, for a while, inkjet printers were really, really popular. And the reason why is because they could print fairly quickly. They are, or at least tend to be, very inexpensive. And the quality is pretty good. But I will tell you that little by little over time, inkjet printers are not as popular anymore. And the reason is because of two things. Number one, laser printers have come way down in price. Even the color ones, they've come way down in price. The second reason is, speaking of price, one of the things about inkjet printers is that they use actual ink, and that ink is very expensive. Now, one of the ways that we started to try to help alleviate the cost of having to replace ink on an inkjet printer is by recycling the cartridges. Okay, so refilling them. Okay, so you could take the cartridges and you could put more ink into an existing cartridge, because the cartridge itself, similar to what we have with our laser printers, where the toner cartridge is more than just toner, it's more than just ink. Your inkjet cartridges have certain technology built into them as well, and that technology doesn't run out, or I should say wear out, as fast as the ink does. So that was one thing we tried to do. But here's the deal. Even with recycling and refilling, the ink is still quite expensive, and by the time all is said and done, you may realize that your nice inexpensive inkjet printer that costs way less than that expensive laser printer would have cost you, you realize that in the end, the cost of ownership was way higher. Okay, by the time you went through all the ink, in the lifetime of the printer itself, once you've printed out X number of pieces of paper with stuff on it, you've gone through enough ink, and you say, wow, I've had to replace the ink so many times, and what it cost me relative to what it cost me, the amount of times I had to replace toner cartridges on a laser printer, in the end, it ended up costing me more for the inkjet printer. So just keep that in mind. But if we want to talk about the process here real fast, the idea is inkjet printers will still create these dots, but they will spray the dots of ink. Now, on the right side of the screen here, I have something called CMYK. Okay, and CMYK is what is used to form all the various colors. Oh, by the way, speaking of colors, that's another reason why inkjet printers were very popular, is because color laser printers were extremely expensive. I mean, I can tell you that I can remember, and this goes way, way back. I mean, this is talking maybe 20 plus years ago. I mean, a long, long time ago. Even if it's not 20, we'll say 15 just to play it safe. So 15, 20 years ago, I remember color laser printers costing somewhere in the area of $8,000 to $10,000. And so when we started having some of the first color inkjet printers come out using this CMYK, which I'll explain this in a second, CMYK, but when we first had them coming out and they were in the low hundreds as opposed to the high thousands, that was a big deal. Okay, because you'd have to go through a lot of ink before you're going to catch up to $10,000 for a color laser printer. But anyway, CMYK stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and then the K, believe it or not, stands for black. And really what I want to do here is this particular ink cartridge that you're looking at, really instead of CMYK, well, I should list it as YKCM. The reason I said CMYK is because that is the actual way that it is technically listed. Okay, it's always listed, that's what the technology is called, it's CYMK. But the reason I changed the letters here is because you can see that we have the yellow, then we have the black, we have the cyan, which is a bluish color, and the magenta, which is a pinkish, purplish, reddish color. Okay, I mean, different people will refer to these as different shades of more primary colors, but I want you to definitely be familiar. I mean, a lot of people will remember, there's a lot of movies actually where they'll make reference to, you know, doing something with the cyan. Last time you'll see like somebody's trying to take apart a bomb and they're being advised to cut the cyan wire, and suddenly they're like, what color is cyan again? All right, and you gotta remember that's the bluish color. All right. So those are the different colors that are used in the combinations of these colors to make all the various colors that you will find, you know, coming out of inkjet printer. Now, there's two main things that I want you to get from how inkjet printers work. Right? I mean, the general idea is, like I said, you have these little ink cartridges, and the idea is they spray the dots of ink out onto the paper, and a lot of the overall makeup of an inkjet printer is, I guess you could say, somewhat similar to a laser printer in the sense that you still have the rollers, right? The paper goes through the rollers, and you still have a fusing assembly. You still fuse the ink on, you know, into the fibers of the paper and stuff like that. But it's the idea of how the ink's actually getting out onto the paper. And there's two forms of inkjet printers. One is called a bubble jet. Okay, and the idea behind bubble jet printing is that what we're going to do, and here's just an example of, we have, you know, just tub of ink, if you want to think of it that way. And we're going to use this heating element. All right, so we're going to use heat to go ahead and heat up the ink, right? So now you'll see here that I've changed this blue cool heating element to a red one, meaning it's getting hot. And when it does that, well, what happens when you heat up liquid? It boils, it bubbles, right? And you get these air bubbles that form, and that air bubble is then going to form pressure, which is going to go ahead and create this little bubble of ink. Okay, so that's what that pressure is going to do. So we have this ink bubble, okay, that basically was pushed out with pressure because we heated up the ink to go ahead and form these little drops that then, in the illustration here, it looks like we're dripping onto the paper, but really it then sprays out. It kind of spatters out onto a dot onto the paper. Okay, and remember, everything is, you know, microscopic in size. Okay, so we're talking about these microscopic dots. We're not talking about something exactly the way I have it illustrated here. Now, when we want to talk about true inkjet printing, this is always a fun one. If we were if we were in person, if we were actually in a classroom together and I was teaching this to you, I always have fun with this one because I always say, you know, instead of, you know, the other bubble jet is like heating up, and so it's almost like, picture if we lit a little fire under your behind, and you'd be like, woo, that's hot. You spit out a little piece of ink. Well, the other way we're going to do it here with standard inkjet printing here is with this piezoelectric element, which right now you'll see is not electrically charged. But once we give it that charge, it's going to form pressure that way. And the way I illustrate this is why I always laugh, and definitely break up the monotony if we were in class together, is I tell you to picture that someone's just standing there, and I walk up from behind them, and I like taser them in the behind, right? And they'd be like, whoa! They just got tasered, putting that pressure out. And that's kind of what's happening here is you create this pressure through this electrical charge, which again is going to form this little ink bubble. And then again, you end up with a spattering, a spraying of a dot of ink that comes out because of that electrical charge. So you know what? That was kind of a lengthy description of bubble jet printing and inkjet printing, whereas the idea is I just want you to keep in mind you can either heat, right? You can either use heat or electricity to create the pressure to make the ink shoot out of the inkjet cartridge. Now, speaking of these cartridges, depending on the specific inkjet printer that you get, in some cases you will have two cartridges, okay, where one is black and the other is all the colors. Whereas other inkjet printers will have one black and then one for each of the other three colors, okay, whether it be the yellow, the magenta, or the cyan. And then, believe it or not, from there are some inkjet printers that will go ahead and get even more precise, and they will break it down into 6 cartridges, okay, where you'll have your black and you have 2, almost like a lighter and a darker cyan. You have 2 for the magenta, a lighter and a darker for that, and a yellow. I don't really want you to focus on this too much here at all. I mean, the bottom line is you go buy an inkjet printer, it's going to tell you what cartridges to get. You get the matching cartridges. And all the cartridges, they all have a number on them. That's one of the things is, if you ever go into like an office supply store and you look at all the ink that's there, they're all number rated. And I suppose technically on the laser printers, we're now getting that with the toner cartridges as well. Just kind of a nice, easy way to remember. You buy a printer and it says you need to match up with this number ink cartridge. And then you just go buy that number ink cartridge. That way if you're searching on the web or you go to a store or whatever, you just ask for the number and they'll give you the right cartridge. All right, so, just keep in mind when it comes to inkjet printers, the printer themselves don't cost that much. The ink does tend to be costly and it doesn't last very long. I can tell you the older inkjet printers, they wanted you to use a special inkjet paper that worked out better with the ink that came with an inkjet printer. You don't see that as much anymore. Another thing you want to keep in mind with an inkjet printer is that the paper itself tends to, this is not a specific guarantee. I mean, different laser printers will work different inkjet printers will work different, but with a laser printer, a lot of times the paper is not put through a lot of trauma. It's not bent. It's kept very straight. I mean, it will roll, but it rolls very smoothly. On an inkjet printer, lots of them, you'll completely flip that paper around. It will be bent pretty severely, and so you can end up with curling if you use cheap paper. So you want to keep that in mind. Now, when it comes to inkjet maintenance, what do you got to do with an inkjet printer? Well, you got to replace the cartridges. That happens all the time. You can do a head cleaning or a nozzle check, okay? The nozzle itself, I mean, if you picture it, all the ink's going through there, it can get clogged, so you may need to clean that out. And then there is calibration because most inkjet printers are color inkjet printers, and as I mentioned earlier, you have to calibrate and line up the colors. By the way, if you're wondering about this calibration, there's not much that you need to know. Each individual printer, whether it be laser or inkjet, it will have a calibration process. And it's a process of where it basically will print out a bunch of lines on a piece of paper, and it'll ask you to visually look and say, all right, in which example, like it'll give you a bunch of examples. It'll say in which example are the lines all lined up into a straight line versus it making kind of a jaggedy line. And once you get it to where all the lines are perfectly lined up straight, they'll be numbered, right? Maybe it'll give you like, let's say 20 different examples, and you'll say, oh, number 12 is as good as it gets. And you tell the printer that. You say number 12 is the right one. And the printer says, okay, so I'm going to go to the setting that I was at when I gave you line number 12. And it's all calibrated. All right, real quick, and then we'll wrap this thing up here. Let's talk about a couple of older types of printers. First one would be impact printers. And by the way, when we talk about impact printers, the most common form of impact printer is something called a dot matrix printer. Okay, they're the old printers, and I know you can't visually see me, but I'm going to make the sound for you. You can always recognize a dot matrix printer because they go, they just go back and forth, back and forth. Okay, the idea behind an impact printer is it's an electronic typewriter, not an electric typewriter. And by the way, if you don't know what a typewriter is, if you're young, back in the old days, and you don't have to go that far back, because even when I was a kid, and I'm not that old, we had typewriters, which is where you would manually hit a button on this thing called a typewriter, and this letter would come up, and it would impact an ink ribbon and then hit the paper, and it would put that letter out onto the paper. Well, the idea behind these impact printers is they were electronic typewriters. I mean, by the way, the reason I clarify between electronic and electric is we also had electric printers where instead of you physically pushing the button, it was an actual mechanism that you physically pushed it down and it physically made the arm go. It electronically, you just tap the button, and a little motor would make the arm go. When I say electronic here, we're talking about having a computer make everything happen. All right, so when it comes to the actual impact printer process, you start off with a piece of paper. From there, you have a print head, and on the print head, you have pins. Right? The pins are because we make dots, right? Everything is printed with dots. Now, this is not my favorite illustration, but the idea here is there is a ribbon here. Okay, it usually isn't white; it would be black. But the problem is this picture wouldn't look real good if I made it black. So picture this black ink ribbon. If you get real sophisticated, there are even different colors, but we'll just say black for simplicity. And the idea is that this print head would move along, and as it moves along the ribbon, these little pins will impact the ribbon, which will then put dots on the paper. Now the two typical, and there's more than two, but the two most typical pin configurations is there was a 9-pin and a 24-pin. And the 9-pin would create what's called draft level printing, and the 24-pin would create more of a letter quality, or what some would call near letter quality, NLQ. So depending on what you were trying to print out and how good you wanted the quality to be. Again, remember, the more dots, the better the quality, right? Now I can also tell you that there are all sorts of different impact printers in the sense that you have one directional, you have two directional, and it has to do with some printers it would literally just kind of go right as the head would go across, and then the head would have to kind of reel itself back over to where it started. So it would go from like left to right, and it would go back over to the left, and then it would go across again. And that noise that I'm making there, that's the noise you would hear as these pins were hitting the paper. But some of them were two directional, where it would go from left to right and then back from right to left. So it would go you go back and forth, and it printed much faster. Now, another main thing to keep in mind with these old dot matrix printers, these old impact printers, what I put in the upper right-hand corner here is what the paper itself would look like. You wouldn't use regular paper. There is no print tray. It doesn't feed individual pieces of paper. You'd have a constant stream of paper, and in order to get sheets of paper, this one long stream of paper would be perforated every, let's say you were trying to get 8.5 by 11. Well, every 11 inches it would be perforated. But the idea here is what you're seeing there are those little dots on the left and right hand side of the paper. Those are actually holes. And those holes would be because you'd have this whole little tractor feed. Okay, so you had this roller, and there were pins on the end of the roller, and those pins, as the roller would spin, would go into the holes and would feed the paper up and through the printer as it's printing. We haven't seen printers like this in quite a while. And although I should laugh and tell you that here where I live, there's a local bowling alley. And at this particular bowling alley, even though they're using, I think it's Windows 7 that they have on the computer that's actually keeping track of the bowling scores, right? So everything's all computerized now, right? No more manual scorekeeping. It's all computerized, blah, blah, blah. Well, at the end of the day, I have young children, and they want to see their scores. They want to see how they did. I ask them for a printout, and believe it or not, they're still using an old dot matrix printer. I have tried to convince them to use something more modern. I've even offered to donate a printer to them. They say they like their dot matrix printer. But otherwise, you don't see it very much anymore. You do occasionally see it with invoicing. One of the main benefits that you have to a dot matrix or an impact type printer is that you can easily make 2 printouts at a time. You can use carbon copy paper, which is a special type of paper that basically it's 2 sheets of paper or 3 sheets of paper, and because you're actually impacting the paper, what it does is the ink will go on the top layer of paper, but then the under layers, the carbon makes a copy underneath, and so you'll still see them used there. Now when it comes to maintenance of a dot matrix printer, which by the way, here's more of a what it actually looks like with the actual roller and the head and the ribbon and all that stuff. First of all, you have ribbon replacement. Okay, so the ribbons, the ink ribbons themselves, well, eventually you're going to use up all the ink. So you got to go ahead and replace the ribbon. The print heads themselves can become damaged, so you may need to replace them. And then, of course, there's paper replacement. And again, it's not individual sheets of paper. It's these big boxes of paper that get sent through the tractor feed. Thermal printers. All right, so here's the deal with thermal printers. A couple of real quick things. First of all, there are 2 types of thermal printer technology. There's something called a direct thermal printer, and then there's thermal wax transfer printers. Here's the deal. Direct thermal printers use a heating element to burn dots onto the surface of special paper. Okay, so keep in mind, it's not so much the printer itself that has some kind of fancy technology, other than it has to use a special paper. Okay, and the paper is made in a way that when these dots are heated up, well, they turn color. And that's why very often where you will see these would be like when you're printing out receipts. Okay, receipt printers very often. That's why the receipts aren't very fancy. They're all one color. And depending on the type of printer, it might be more of a black, it might be more of a blue. Okay, it all has to do with the paper. Sometimes it's even a red. Okay, whereas the thermal wax printers works with a special type of film that is coated with wax, and what will happen is the thermal or the heated print head will pass over a ribbon that will then melt the wax onto the paper. So in this case, you don't need special paper, but as you can kind of imagine, if you're going to be melting wax onto paper, the quality is not going to be real good. All right, so that's not much else I want to tell you when it comes to thermal printers. I mean, they're typically your receipt printers. You either use a special paper that gets heated up and it changes colors in that fashion, or you have a special wax that is melted onto the paper. Now, when it comes to the maintenance of, here you see my fancy little receipt printer that I have here. You got to replace the paper. That's probably the main thing you're gonna do, right? You get the little rolls of paper. They run out, and you always know when they're gonna run out because you got that usually like a pinkish or bluish line that'll start running along the edge. You know you're getting low. You may need to clean the heating element itself because, again, remember, thermal printer, it's all about heat. It uses heat. That thermal. It's all about temperature. So there's a lot of heating involved, so the heating elements themselves might need to be cleaned. And or any other debris, especially if you're using the thermal wax, then you may need to clean some extra debris out of there. Not a lot to it, to tell you the truth. Now, when it comes to installing a printer, here's the deal. It really kind of comes down to terminology that I want you to understand. Okay, so the first thing is you need to know the difference between a printer versus a print device. And I have to be honest here, I'm not using necessarily the CompTIA terminology. They talk about software versus hardware device. In Microsoft world, I've taught a lot of Microsoft. They've taught me to teach you. It's all about the terms printer versus print device. Printer is a software representation of the printing hardware within the operating system. Okay, so if you're using Windows, so to speak, you'll have a printer. And that's the software representation that you see that represents that physical print device that actually has the paper in it. The printer will use something called a printer driver, which allows the software to communicate with the hardware. Okay, so if you ever hear the term driver, this is something we'll talk about in more detail, more on the 802 exam. Okay, so that's more on that in that arena. But the term driver is really nothing more than a piece of software that actually has the instructions to allow the operating system or the computer software to communicate with the hardware. Whereas a print device is the actual hardware. Okay, so printer is software, print device is hardware. Now another thing you need to know the difference is when we talk about local printers versus network printers. And even that in itself, you got to be careful about the term printer versus print device. If we're talking about a local print device versus a network print device, the local print device is one that is physically connected to the computer. Okay, so it is some way, somehow, we'll say USB is probably the most common form. If it's actually connected directly to your computer, then it's considered to be a local print device. Whereas a network print device is one that would be connected to your network, meaning it's a print device, a physical printer, a physical piece of hardware that has an Ethernet card in it. And using an Ethernet cable, you'll connect it to the network. It'll get an IP address, and the computer will then access this printer via, I have here with the Ethernet connection, but basically via the network. Okay, so via the TCP/IP versus via the IP address. Now the reason I separate here local versus network when it comes to print devices versus printers, when installing a printer in Windows, a local printer is one that is installed and managed directly on the computer. Whether it is a local or a network print device doesn't matter. Meaning if it's a network print device that uses Ethernet to connect, it still can be a local printer, which means that it is actually installed and managed right there on the individual computer. Whereas a network printer is one that you are installing from something called a print server. Okay, and the print server will actually have the printers installed locally and then share access to those printers out with other computers. And those other computers will then access them by calling it a network printer. And the idea is, even though it'll show up as a printer that's on the individual computer, it's actually being managed. Okay, so all the print jobs are being sent out to the print server and they're being managed out on the print server. And the last thing before we bring this to a close here is to talk about the different connectivity options. And I will tell you point blank that what I have listed for you here is straight from the CompTIA objectives. Okay, they want to make sure that you're familiar with the idea that a wired printer can be connected using USB, parallel, serial, or Ethernet. Okay, those are the physical cables you can use. And I will tell you that serial connectivity hasn't been used since the Dark Ages. It's been a long time. And for that matter, parallel basically has not been used very much either. Typically what you'll find as far as the wired options is USB and Ethernet. And on the wireless side, we have Bluetooth, 802.11. I don't like that they have a 11x. What they're basically saying there is X is not a literal, that's a variable. Right? You might be using 802.11b, you might be using 802.11g, you might be using 802.11n, all the different wireless technologies. Or you can even use infrared, which again hasn't been used since, I don't know that I personally have ever even seen a printer connected via infrared. I know that it's always existed. I don't know that I've ever seen it. So realistically, I just want you to keep in mind that typically you're going to find USB, Ethernet, and 802.11 wireless. Those occasionally Bluetooth. Okay, those are, I'd say Bluetooth in a home environment, because Bluetooth is very, very, very short range, and you're gonna have to have the printer right up near the computer. And at that point, if it's gonna be that close, you might as well just use a USB cable. So anyway, those are the main connectivity options that we have, when connecting printers to our computers. And with that, that does bring us to the end of this lesson. I'm sorry that it was kind of a long lesson. There's a lot to talk about, and well, let's be real. I talk a lot. But here's the bottom line. In the beginning of this lesson, talked about some general characteristics, DPI, PPM, stuff like that. Great. We then talked about the different types of printers, and the one thing that I want you to keep in mind, above and beyond everything else, if you didn't learn anything else, please, please, please make sure that you are familiar with the 6-step laser printing process. You have to know it. You have to know it for real life in order to troubleshoot a laser printer. You have to know it for the exam. It's so important to know. So, and quite frankly, when I first learned it, I thought it was very interesting. I always wondered how a laser printer worked. I always wondered what was going on in there. So make sure you pull that out. And then the last thing is real quick. I just kind of wrapped up the idea of installing or connecting a printer. We have our different connectivity options, and make sure you know the difference between a printer or the software printer versus the actual print device or a hardware printer. And with that, I thank you for watching this lesson, and I will see you in the next one.